My immigration lawyer, Carlos Rodriguez, had been telling me the process is ongoing for 5 years. I had paid him $120,000. In reality, he had never filed any paperwork. He was keeping me illegal and waiting for me to be deported, then planning to extract more money from my family. My name is Miguel Santos. I'm 34 years old, and I just discovered that the attorney I'd trusted to legalize my immigration status had actually been systematically defrauding me while keeping me vulnerable to deportation. But what I learned about Carlos Rodriguez's operation would prove that my stolen money was just one piece of a much larger criminal enterprise that had been targeting undocumented immigrants for years. Standing in the legitimate immigration attorney's office, looking at records that showed no applications had ever been filed on my behalf, despite 5 years of payments, I felt like I was staring at evidence of the most calculated exploitation imaginable. According to these official documents, Carlos Rodriguez had collected $120,000 from my family while providing absolutely no legal services. But according to everything Carlos had told me about my case, my green card application was progressing through the complex immigration system, and approval was always just months away. The family whose future I'd been fighting for included my wife Carmen and our 2 young children, all of whom had been living in fear of deportation, while trusting that Carlos was protecting our legal status. To understand how Carlos had been able to exploit our family's desperation while appearing to provide legitimate legal representation, I need to explain how we'd come to trust him and why we'd never questioned his methods or timeline. I had first come to the United States from El Salvador 15 years earlier, crossing the border without documentation when I was 19 years old. Like many undocumented immigrants, I'd lived in constant fear of deportation while working construction jobs and trying to build a life in a country where I had no legal status. You need to get your papers, friends in the immigrant community had told me repeatedly. Living without status is too dangerous, especially now with increased enforcement. The decision to seek legal help had been driven by the birth of my first child, Isabella, and my marriage to Carmen, who was a U.S. citizen. Our marriage should have provided a pathway to legal residency, but the immigration system was complex and intimidating. You qualify for adjustment of status based on your marriage to a U.S. citizen, Carlos Rodriguez had explained during our first consultation. The process is straightforward, but it requires careful documentation and proper legal representation. Carlos had come highly recommended by several people in our community who claimed he'd successfully helped them obtain legal status. His office had appeared professional, and his credentials had seemed legitimate. I've been practicing immigration law for 12 years, he told us. I've helped hundreds of families navigate the system and achieve legal residency. How long does the process typically take? For adjustment of status based on marriage to a U.S. citizen, we're usually looking at 12 to 18 months from filing to approval. What are the costs involved? My fee is $8,000 for the complete case, plus government filing fees of approximately $2,000. It's a significant investment, but legal status is invaluable for your family's future. The contract we'd signed with Carlos had outlined a comprehensive legal strategy that included adjustment of status application, work authorization, and travel documents that would allow me to live and work legally while my case was pending. The first step is gathering all required documentation, Carlos had explained. Birth certificates, marriage certificate, financial records, medical examinations. The government requires extensive proof that your marriage is legitimate. The documentation process had been exhaustive and expensive. Carlos had required certified translations of documents from El Salvador, medical examinations from approved physicians, and financial affidavits that demonstrated Carmen's ability to support me. Immigration cases require meticulous preparation, Carlos had said. Any missing document or error in the application can result in denial or delays that could take years to resolve. Over the first 6 months, we'd paid Carlos an additional $12,000 for document preparation, translations, and what he'd described as expediting fees to ensure our application received priority processing. The government has been slow lately, he'd explained when I'd asked about filing timelines. But I've submitted everything in your case is now in the system. Carlos had provided what appeared to be official confirmation that my application had been filed, including receipt numbers and case tracking information that seemed legitimate. You can check your case status online using these numbers, he'd told me. But I handle all communications with immigration services to ensure consistency and prevent any issues that might arise from direct contact. The periodic updates Carlos had provided about my case had always indicated progress, but with delays that he'd attributed to bureaucratic inefficiency and increased scrutiny of immigration applications. Your case is moving through the system, he'd report during our monthly check-ins. There have been some delays due to backlogs at the processing center, but we should hear something within the next few months. It's been over a year. Isn't that longer than you originally estimated? Immigration timelines are unpredictable, especially with the current political climate. The important thing is that your application is active and you're protected from deportation while it's pending. What about work authorization? When will I be able to get that? Work authorization typically comes about 6 months after filing, but there have been delays across the board. I'm following up on your employment authorization document. Each delay Carlos had described had come with additional fees for extra legal work, expediting requests, or responses to government inquiries that he claimed were slowing our case. Immigration is requesting additional evidence about your marriage, he told us during our second year. This is routine, but it requires careful preparation to ensure we provide exactly what they're looking for. What kind of additional evidence? Joint bank accounts, lease agreements, photos, witness statements, anything that demonstrates the legitimacy of your marriage relationship. How much will that cost? Preparing the evidence response will require about 20 hours of legal work, so an additional $4,000. By the third year, our payments to Carlos had exceeded $50,000, but I still had no work authorization and no indication that my case was moving toward approval. The processing times had been longer than anyone expected, Carlos had explained. But your case is still active, and we're maintaining your protected status. Can we get any official updates directly from immigration services? Direct contact from applicants can actually hurt cases by creating confusion in the file. I handle all official communications to protect your interests. What about visiting the immigration office in person? That's not advisable. Appearing at immigration offices without proper legal representation can trigger enforcement actions. Carlos's warnings about the dangers of contacting immigration services directly had been effective in keeping me isolated from independent information. About my case status, the fourth year had brought new complications that Carlos had described as requiring additional legal strategies and fees. Immigration has implemented new security clearances that are affecting cases from certain countries, he'd explained. El Salvador is on the list, which means additional background checks and processing delays. How long will this add to the process? Potentially another 12 to 18 months. But I'm working on strategies to expedite your case through the new requirements. What strategies? There are specialized applications and waivers that can help move cases through enhanced security review. It requires additional legal work, but it's worth pursuing. The specialized applications Carlos had recommended had cost an additional $25,000 and had supposedly addressed various immigration law changes and policy updates that he'd claimed were affecting my case. Immigration law is constantly evolving, he'd said. Staying ahead of policy changes is crucial for protecting your status and ensuring your case moves forward. But by the 5th year, when Carlos was still collecting monthly fees and providing updates about ongoing delays, I'd begun to suspect that something was fundamentally wrong with how my case was being handled. The investigation I'd begun revealed the scope of Carlos's fraudulent operation and the systematic methods he'd used to exploit undocumented immigrants' fears while providing no legitimate legal services, working with a legitimate immigration attorney named Maria Gonzalez and a fraud investigator from the State Bar Association. I discovered that Carlos Rodriguez had never filed any immigration applications on my behalf, despite collecting $120,000 over 5 years. Carlos has been running a systematic fraud operation targeting undocumented immigrants, Attorney Gonzalez explained during our first meeting. He collects fees for legal services he never provides while keeping his clients in limbo through fear and misinformation. How many other people has he defrauded? We've identified at least 47 families over the past 8 years who paid Carlos for immigration services they never received. The total amount stolen exceeds $2.8 million. How has he avoided detection for so long? Because undocumented immigrants are afraid to report problems to authorities, and they often don't understand the immigration system well enough to recognize when they are being defrauded. The investigation revealed Carlos's methods for targeting vulnerable immigrant families and maintaining the illusion that he was providing legitimate legal representation. Carlos specifically targets undocumented immigrants who are desperate for legal status, the investigator explained. He exploits their fear of deportation and their lack of familiarity with the legal system. What about the case tracking numbers and documentation he provided? All fake. Carlos creates fraudulent documents that appear official but have no connection to actual government systems. The evidence also showed that Carlos had been using his clients' personal information for identity theft and had been reporting some clients to immigration enforcement when they stopped making payments. Carlos keeps detailed records on his clients' personal information, work locations, and family members, the investigator continued. When clients become suspicious or stop paying, he sometimes reports them to ICE as a way to maintain control over other clients. So he was using deportation as a threat? Exactly. Carlos would tell clients that questioning his methods or seeking second opinions would result in their cases being canceled and immediate deportation proceedings. But the most disturbing aspect of Carlos's operation wasn't just the financial fraud. It was the psychological manipulation he'd used to keep vulnerable families trapped in legal limbo while stealing their money. Carlos deliberately keeps clients in a state of fear and uncertainty, Attorney Gonzalez explained. He provides just enough false hope to keep them paying while ensuring they remain vulnerable to deportation. Why doesn't he actually file the applications and collect legitimate fees? Because legitimate immigration work requires actual legal expertise and carries professional liability. Carlos's scheme is designed to collect maximum money with minimum work and no accountability. The legal proceedings against Carlos were complicated by the fact that many of his victims were afraid to come forward due to their immigration status and fear of deportation. Undocumented immigrants who have been victimized by legal fraud are often reluctant to report crimes, explained Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh. They fear that cooperating with law enforcement might result in their own deportation. What evidence do we have against Carlos? Financial records showing fraudulent fee collection, fake documents he created to deceive clients, and testimony from multiple victims who paid for services they never received. Carlos was ultimately charged with 52 counts of fraud, identity theft, and practicing law in a way that violated professional standards. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including bank records, fake documents, and testimony from dozens of families he'd defrauded. The trial revealed the scope of Carlos's predatory enterprise and the calculated methods he'd used to exploit immigrants' vulnerability and desperation. Rodriguez specifically targeted undocumented immigrants because he knew they would be afraid to report fraud and would be willing to pay almost anything for the possibility of legal status. Prosecutor Walsh explained during her opening statement. He weaponized their fear of deportation against them. The evidence presented during the trial showed that Carlos had collected over $2.8 million from 47 families while providing absolutely no legitimate legal services. Not a single immigration application was ever filed on behalf of any victim, Prosecutor Walsh continued. Rodriguez was running a complete fraud operation disguised as immigration law practice. Carlos was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to pay $3.2 million in restitution to his victims and permanently disbarred from practicing law. But for the families Carlos had victimized, the criminal conviction provided limited relief. Most of the stolen money had been spent, making full restitution unlikely, and the lost years had meant that their immigration situations had become more complicated and difficult to resolve. The worst part isn't the money we lost, I reflected during my victim impact statement. It's the 5 years my family lived in fear while Carlos was supposed to be protecting us. The experience fundamentally changed how I approach immigration legal services and taught me the importance of verifying attorney credentials and seeking independent confirmation of case progress. Always verify that applications have actually been filed by checking directly with government agencies, Attorney Gonzalez advised. Legitimate attorneys will encourage clients to monitor their own cases and will provide government confirmation, numbers that can be independently verified. The case led to increased oversight of immigration attorneys and mandatory reporting requirements for suspicious patterns in immigration law practices. The most important protection for immigrant families is education about what legitimate legal representation looks like and verification of any attorney's credentials and case filings. Attorney Gonzalez explained. 2 years after Carlos's conviction, my family finally achieved legal status through legitimate legal representation. The process took 14 months and cost $12,000, a fraction of what we'd paid Carlos for nothing. Real immigration work is complex, but straightforward, I've learned. Anyone who makes the process seem mysterious or keeps you from understanding your own case is probably exploiting your lack of knowledge. The immigration attorney who had promised to protect my family's future had actually been stealing from it while keeping us vulnerable to the very deportation he claimed to be preventing. Sometimes the people who promise to help us achieve our dreams are actually the ones profiting from keeping those dreams out of reach. And sometimes the most important protection we can provide for our families is our own skepticism about anyone who asks for money while discouraging us from understanding or monitoring our own legal situations. Carlos Rodriguez had built his entire criminal enterprise on exploiting the fear and desperation of undocumented immigrants, using their vulnerability to steal money while providing false hope and keeping them trapped in the exact situation they were paying him to resolve.